Hi there, my name's Sarah Cuesta and I'm going to be making a video for Professor Miller's ITL 518 Science Integration class. And my lesson is going to be about sinking and floating, and it's designated for a kindergarten classroom. So I would start with introducing my students to the carpet and me sitting in front of them and asking them, does anyone have examples of things that float? Does anyone have examples of things that sink? And I would call on my students that maybe have ideas. I would write them on the whiteboard just to keep track of their ideas. These are the hypothesis, the idea, building block. We would then pull out a story I would have picked before starting, and it's called What Floats and What Sinks, and it's by Jennifer Boothroyd, and this is what the story would look like. So I would read this to my students, and the story introduces things that float, things that sink. It's very child appropriate. It's ages 5 to 6, 7, 8. So this, I think, would be a really good starting point. I would then go to the whiteboard and I would say, okay, can anyone give me a list of things that float? And I'll call on multiple students, and then I'll say, okay, let's talk about sinking. What items do you think would sink? After that, I would have made a worksheet for all of my students, and it would look like this. It would be printed from the computer, and it would say, sink versus float. I would also then have I would count off my students by 4s, and I would put them in groups. And I would have them go to their desks. Each group would have a bucket waiting for them and objects waiting for them. Now I would say, don't start yet. Eyes on me. And I would have the objects and my bucket in front of me. And I would say, I'm gonna do 2 items with you. We're gonna do it as a class, and then you're gonna break up into your groups and you're gonna do it on your own. What I would do is I would take a sponge and I would say, okay class, put a finger on your nose if you think it's gonna sink. Raise your hand if you think it's gonna float. Sink, float. They'd all do it before I start. And then I'd say 3, 2, 1. Who knew it was gonna float? Who knew it was gonna sink? Wahoo, yay! We'd all cheer each other on. Okay, let's do maybe one more. I'm gonna grab this leaf, arts and crafts leaf. Finger on your nose if you think it's gonna sink. Hand up high if you think it's gonna float. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Here I have an example of floating, sinking. I would say, does anyone have any questions? Does anyone have any thoughts on any of this? I would also want to tell them, well, I might say that to the end. So I would say, okay guys, I'm gonna walk around, you can ask me questions, I'm gonna look over your shoulder. The one thing I'd really like you to do is one item at a time, and when you see if it sinks or float, I want you to write it on your chart. So you would say sponge, float. You'd say leaf, sink. And we'll keep track of it, and then at the end, I'm gonna have everyone come together and we're gonna share our findings and see if there's any differences, similarities, what we found. Go ahead. And they would go and do that. I would say, okay guys, that looks really great. I'd check in with my students. I'd say, this looks really fantastic. Oh, let's try that item again. I would just, roam around. This is where I would be able to assess their learning, their knowledge, all of that. So when we were done with that, I would call everyone back to the carpet. We would leave our bucket, but I have my bucket and the same items that they had at their desk. I have it all in front of me. So I would say, before we do it all together, I wanna know, can anyone define sink? Maybe some kids had ideas of what sink meant, maybe not. I would define it as the action of an object when it becomes submerged in a liquid is sinking. When you put an object in liquid and it sinks to the bottom, it goes to the bottom, that's sinking. And I would ask, okay, can anyone define floating? Maybe some of my kids now had an idea after doing the experiment. I would say, floating is the action of an object when it sits on the surface. It's like sitting on top, it's right on top. Okay, so then we would do it together. I would take my objects, right? Plastic spoon. What did everyone get? What did these groups get? They would tell me, we think it's gonna float. We got that it sank. Well, let me see. Oh, it's the action of an object when it sits on the surface, so it floats. But what about like a heavier fork. That spoon was pretty light, right, class? Okay, but this fork is heavy. Let's see what happens. Sink. So how's our charts looking? What does it look like? Great, class. What about puffballs? Little cotton balls, these little balls. They're a little heavy. They're heavier than a piece of paper. What would happen? Oh, they float. Two more. Nail polish. What will happen with nail polish? It sank. Last one, a little scrunchy hair tie thing. Let's see. It sank too. Very cool. So what did we find? What did you guys see? What did you learn with this? What other objects could we use? Maybe I would assign one kid at a time to go find an object in the classroom to bring to my bucket and we see together. We can keep this going. So at the end of this, I would then ask my students, can anyone tell me if they've heard of the word buoyancy? Now for kindergarteners, I'm guessing they have not. So this is where my higher order thinking comes in. Buoyancy, what could buoyancy mean? So I'd want them all, I would spell it on the board, I would show them, and I want them to put it on a piece of paper. And I want them to take that piece of paper home and talk to their families. What's buoyancy? The next day we'd come in and I want them to tell me what their family's report of buoyancy was, and I would tie it into the lesson the previous day. And I would say the buoyancy is the ability to float in liquid. So a beach ball is very buoyant, where a marble is not buoyant at all. It's because the ball of air is less dense than water. So obviously this is like higher order thinking. This is bigger. This is the next idea. This lesson seems very on target for kindergartners, but buoyancy seems like the next level in my opinion. So that's my lesson on sinking versus floating. This is how I would design it. And I wanted to take a minute because there's some questions on our assignment and I wanted to make sure I outlined where they were. So select a time when you describe the learning goal. The learning goal is talking about sinking and floating in the beginning of the lesson, talking about what we know can sink, talking about what we know can float, thinking about it. And the learning activity I chose was doing the story to begin my lesson. And then select a time when you describe the informal assessment. My informal assessment is when I walk around and I watch my students working in teams, look at their worksheets, checking in with them, seeing how they're doing with the experiment. This is informal because it's not like a written test. Select a time when you ask a higher order thinking question. That's the buoyancy. I think that's like a really good next level, could build on density, could talk about molecules, can talk about a lot more things. But I think the best and most important part is having visuals, hands-on. These were items I had in my home. I think being able to excuse them at the end of the lesson to find things in the classroom that they'd be interested in putting in my bucket might be a really fun, hands-on, engaging way to incorporate everybody also. So this is what I did for science ITL 518. Can't wait to use it in my future classroom.